It becomes very clear when you start studying Silicon Valley and you start studying the rise of Apple that Steve Jobs is the douchebag. And I mean that in the nicest way possible.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to A Conversation with Colin. I'm Greg, and this is my roommate, Colin. Now, Colin has a tendency to say crazy stuff sometimes. So every Tuesday and Thursday, we reach into the topic pile, pull one out, toss it at Colin, talk it out here for your enjoyment. If you like that, like the video, subscribe to this channel, share it with your friends. We'll all have fun. Colin, are you ready?
Yes.
You have no idea what I'm about to read to you.
Nope.
Today's topic of conversation is Steve Jobs.
Oh.
You're a hypocrite.
Oh, am I?
Yeah, you remember? I remember I had the iPhone forever, and you were happy with your Palm Pre, this terrible little device, and then you finally got on board, got an iPhone, and then you started, this is great and this is awesome, and you read the Steve Jobs biography.
Yeah.
Answer for your crimes.
So we're talking specifically about Steve Jobs, or we're talking about Apple?
Well, that includes everything, doesn't it?
Okay. Oh, I guess so.
I can fix it if you want. I can write on the card Apple.
No, it's fine. It's your card, and
Yeah,
it's your
right.
tool to use as you want. So one of my favorite topics to read about is the history of Silicon Valley. And I've read most, if not all, of the big major works that have been released.
Okay.
Because there aren't like a lot of them. And so I did read Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs biography, but let me rewind a little bit.
Sure,
Because,
please do.
It becomes very clear when you start studying Silicon Valley and you start studying the rise of Apple that Steve Jobs is the douchebag. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. Steve Jobs is a visionary, and Apple would have never been what it was without him. But without the technical knowledge, which he really lacked, I think that Steve Jobs gets all of the credit for what's great at Apple without really giving the credit to the people that actually deserve it. And I think that the person, obviously, that's overlooked the most is Steve Wozniak.
The Woz.
And so I think that Steve Jobs is an interesting character. He's super interesting, and reading the Walter Isaacson biography, it made it appear, especially later when he came back after being ousted from Apple and coming back in the 90s, that he was instrumental in getting everything going for Apple. Because Apple was really a quarter or two away from dying when he came back.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to believe today because Apple is one of the biggest corporations in the world. But man, they were getting their clock cleaned in the 90s, and they were making terrible devices like the Newton and all this shit that no one wanted. And he was the visionary behind, let's have almost another Macintosh with iMac, and let's do the iPod, and let's do the iPhone and the iPad. I mean, he was the visionary behind those things, and that's great. But when you study him in the 70s, there's so many awful stories about him that I think you can't help, if you know those stories, to kind of look at him a little bit dubiously. And I can regale them.
Please do. This is your conversation.
So one story that is really fascinating to me is Steve Jobs went to Xerox. Xerox had, a lot of people don't know, Xerox owned something called PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. And Xerox is a New York-based company, and PARC was in Silicon Valley. And Xerox was basically just giving them unlimited amounts of money to just build whatever they wanted. And Xerox PARC made something called Xerox Alto, which is really the first personal computer. And it had color graphics. It used a GUI, graphics user interface. It had Ethernet. They were sending email. They had a laser printer. They had all these things that no one had any idea what the shit was. And Xerox certainly had no idea what it was. They even invented the mouse. And one of the famous stories about that is Xerox went to New York and with the mouse in the 70s and was like, we made this thing called the mouse, and we want you to look at it or whatever. And they passed it around the board table, and everyone looked at it. And the CEO was like, you want me to manufacture something called a mouse? And then basically threw it back at them and sent them back out west.
Yeah.
And so Xerox, in return for I think some Apple shares, gave them Apple access to Xerox's PARC. And they went there and stole everything. And everything they stole ended up in the Mac. So Wozniak made Apple I and Apple II, but then the Macintosh was really the first computer that was supposed to be the educational machine. It was really, quite technologically advanced. Sure. And they stole everything from Xerox, and they did it blatantly, and they poached almost everyone from PARC to make the computer. As
in the documentary Pirates of Silicon Valley, starring Noe Wiley.
Yes.
It's a good movie.
So later, Bill Gates from Microsoft gets a Macintosh so they can start building things for some software. And what they end up doing instead is creating Windows, basically stealing the operating system of Macintosh, putting it on PCs in Japan, and then selling them there. And I think NEC was the first computers that had them. So Steve Jobs called Bill Gates over and basically called him a hypocrite and a liar and a thief and all those things. And
you're stealing from us!
The famous line, of course, in Pirates of Silicon Valley.
Such a good movie.
And Bill Gates is the first guy to tell it like it is, and he's like, you stole from Xerox and we stole from you, so why don't you stop being a hypocrite about it? And that's just one of the many stories. Of course, another story is that Steve Jobs used to work at Atari, And Steve Jobs was tasked with creating games like Breakout for Atari 2600. And he had Steve Wozniak help him with the game. And if he can get it on as few chips as possible, they would give him a bonus to make the manufacturing costs as cheap as possible. And Steve Wozniak was a genius. So Steve Wozniak made it on like ridiculous, just made the board so small and so compact. And Steve Jobs got a windfall from Atari. And then lied to Steve Wozniak about how much money he was paid and gave him like $500 of the money. While he promised to split the bonus with him.
So why did Woz keep working with him?
I think Wozniak was like a little bit naive, but I also think Wozniak was altruistic. I think that he believed, they used to have this thing in the 70s at Berkeley called the Homebrew Computer Club, where they would basically share things with each other, and they would share pirated software basically and all these things. And that was where Apple I was introduced. And Wozniak wanted to give Apple I to everyone and let them kind of play with it. And Steve Jobs was the one, to his credit, that said, like, we can sell this and make a lot of money, and that's how their partnership was forged. So I think that like they had an interesting partnership, and obviously when Apple went public, Steve Wozniak became rich and then kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
So I just think that Steve Jobs is just an unsavory dude. I think that there's like a lot of, he had a daughter with a woman and basically neglected her for 15 years, named a computer after her, Apple Lisa, but totally ignored and neglected her, pretended that she didn't exist. Like he's just he's not a nice guy. And when you read Walter Isaacson's biography, like he doesn't hold back.
So do you think, when Steve passed not too long ago, it was very much this like whole like giant worldwide grieving thing and stuff. Did he make up for it in the end? Like we keep talking about this stuff in his past. Did his presence catch up to where, he did eventually acknowledge Lisa. He did start taking care of her and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Is history's portrait accurate of him now?
Yeah, I think that like first of all, I recommend that everyone read the book, because the book's absolutely fascinating. Walter Isaacson's like a really brilliant biographer, and he had unlimited and unprecedented access to Steve Jobs, especially when Steve Jobs was dying. And that's when he was saying, like for those 2 years when he was just saying everything that he needed to say. And I think that he was trying to redeem himself. But I think that the proof is going to be in the pudding, specifically about how Apple in the next 5 or 10 years survives without him, because I think the story is going to be written about him, how much of a visionary he really was, if Apple starts to tank.
Sure.
Because Apple was great with him and then fell off the planet. He came back, they were great again, and now we're in this period where, with Tim Cook and all these guys, where we don't really know what they're going to do next. And what's the next, they can iterate on iPhone and iPad all they want, but they need something new, and like without him there, who knows? I think that like he's just an unsavory dude, but obviously one of the great visionaries, really one of the great American technological forces in all of history. I mean, you have to look at him, up there with Edison, and guys like that. I mean, just like,
Sure.
Henry Ford, like dudes that knew their shit, pioneered an entire industry.
George Washington Carver,
of course, the master of the peanut. So, yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, I think Steve Jobs is a really complicated figure, and I think like many figures, I think his history will be written a long time from now when we kind of have more clarity.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Colin. I think that wraps up our conversation. What do you think? Steve Jobs, douchebag, visionary, good guy? Let us know in the comments below. Then like the video, share it with your friends. Subscribe to us here on the YouTubes, as I think it's called. And until then, I hope you have a conversational day.